In the early hours of a freezing New York morning, the city streets glowed under artificial lights, casting long shadows over the few souls braving the cold. Among them was Jimmy, a 17-year-old homeless boy who shuffled through the streets, his thin coat barely enough to keep out the biting wind. The city, always bustling and full of life, seemed indifferent to Jimmy, who had learned to navigate its alleys and corners, unseen and unheard. As he walked down Lexington Avenue, the early risers began to appear, hurrying to their destinations with a purpose Jimmy could no longer remember. It had been weeks since he had eaten a proper meal, and the gnawing hunger in his belly was a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Lost in his thoughts, Jimmy was startled by a man in a sharp suit rushing past him, nearly knocking him over. The man was clearly in a hurry, his phone pressed to his ear, his eyes focused on something far ahead. In his haste, the man dropped something, a wallet, brown leather, and well-worn but clearly valuable. Jimmy hesitated, his instincts kicking in. He quickly glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. People kept moving, unaware of the boy who had just found what could be his lifeline. He knelt down and picked up the wallet, feeling the weight of it in his hand. His stomach tightened as he opened the wallet, revealing a thick wad of cash. Hundreds of dollars, maybe more, and several credit cards tucked neatly behind the bills. Jimmy's heart raced. This money could change everything. He could eat a warm meal, find a place to stay for the night, maybe even longer. But as he fumbled through the contents, something stopped him. A photograph, slipped between the bills, caught his eye. It was the man who had dropped the wallet, smiling beside a woman and a young child. They looked happy, secure, everything Jimmy wasn't. The image triggered a memory. Something Hank, an old homeless man who had once looked out for Jimmy, used to say, "Honesty is the one thing they can't take from you." Jimmy closed the wallet, his mind spinning. He could keep the money and buy himself some time, some relief from the relentless struggle of life on the streets. But something inside him, a voice buried deep, urged him to do the right thing. He looked up, spotting the hospital at the end of the street. It was the direction the man had been heading in. With a deep breath, Jimmy began to walk toward the hospital, the wallet clutched tightly in his hand, feeling the weight of it growing lighter with each step. As Jimmy approached the hospital, the imposing building loomed over him, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow that made everything seem even colder. He hesitated at the entrance, feeling the warmth from inside spilling out into the chilly air. For a moment, the urge to turn around and walk away gnawed at him. After all, who would miss a few $100s? But then he thought of the photograph in the wallet, the smiling family, and the choice became clear. Jimmy stepped through the automatic doors, immediately hit by the sterile smell of disinfectant and the muffled sounds of hospital life. Nurses hurried past, their expressions serious and focused, while patients sat in the waiting area, some looking anxious, others resigned. Jimmy felt out of place, his ragged clothes and unwashed face drawing a few curious glances. He pulled his hood lower over his head, trying to blend into the background. Clutching the wallet in his pocket, he scanned the lobby, searching for the man he had seen earlier. After a few tense minutes, he spotted him at the reception desk, speaking urgently with a nurse. The man's face was drawn, worry etched into every line. Jimmy watched as the nurse nodded sympathetically, then handed the man a clipboard. This was his chance. Taking a deep breath, Jimmy approached, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got closer, the man turned and noticed him. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, Jimmy considered turning back. But he forced himself to continue, drawing the wallet from his pocket. "Excuse me, sir," Jimmy said, his voice barely audible above the hum of the hospital. The man looked at him, surprised. "You dropped this outside," Jimmy added, holding out the wallet. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. "Oh my God," he murmured, taking the wallet from Jimmy's hand. He quickly opened it, checking the contents, then looked back at Jimmy, a mix of relief and gratitude washing over his face. "Thank you. Thank you so much," he stammered, still processing the unexpected kindness. Jimmy shifted awkwardly on his feet, unsure of what to say. "It's nothing, really," he muttered, already feeling the familiar urge to retreat into the background. But before he could move, The man reached out and touched his arm gently. "Wait," he said, his tone softening. "I was in such a rush, I didn't even realize. I'm on my way to see my daughter. She's very sick, and I can't thank you enough for this." Jimmy nodded, feeling a pang of empathy. The man's sincerity was clear, and for a moment, the weight of his own struggle seemed to lessen in the face of someone else's pain. The man looked at Jimmy, his expression shifting from relief to something more inquisitive. He seemed to notice, really notice, Jimmy for the first time. The worn clothes, the hollow cheeks, the tired eyes. Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice tinged with concern. Jimmy froze, unprepared for the question. He wasn't used to people asking about him, much less caring. "Yeah, I'm fine," he lied, his instinct to protect himself kicking in, but the man wasn't convinced. He glanced around, then back at Jimmy. "Listen," he began, hesitating slightly. "Why don't you come with me? I was just about to get something to eat in the cafeteria before going upstairs. I'd like to buy you a meal, as a thank you." Jimmy's first reaction was to decline. He wasn't looking for charity, just trying to do the right thing. But the man's eyes were kind, and the thought of a hot meal was too tempting to resist. Finally, Jimmy nodded. "Okay, sure," he said quietly. The man smiled, relief evident in his expression. "I'm Matthew, by the way. Dr. Matthew Carter," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Jimmy," the boy replied, shaking the doctor's hand with a grip that was firmer than he expected. "All right, Jimmy," Dr. Carter said, leading him toward the cafeteria. "Let's get you something to eat." As they walked, Jimmy couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not as just another nameless face on the streets, but as a person. The hospital cafeteria was a busy place, filled with doctors, nurses, and visitors grabbing quick meals between shifts and visits. The smell of fresh coffee and warm food wafted through the air, making Jimmy's stomach growl in anticipation. Dr. Matthew Carter guided him through the line, encouraging Jimmy to choose whatever he wanted. Jimmy hesitated, his eyes darting between the various options. It had been so long since he had the luxury of choosing what to eat. Finally, he settled on a hot sandwich, a bowl of soup, and a large cup of orange juice. Dr. Carter didn't blink at the amount, simply nodding approvingly as he paid for their meals. They found a quiet corner of the cafeteria and sat down. Jimmy ate cautiously at first, but once the first bite hit his tongue, he couldn't stop himself. He devoured the sandwich, barely tasting it as his hunger took over. Dr. Carter watched him, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "You don't have to rush," Dr. Carter said gently, noticing how quickly Jimmy was eating. "There's plenty of food. Take your time." Jimmy slowed down, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Sorry," he mumbled. "It's just, I don't usually eat like this." Dr. Carter nodded, understanding more than Jimmy realized. "How long have you been on the streets?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Jimmy paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He wasn't used to talking about his situation, especially with strangers. But something about Dr. Carter's tone, the genuine concern in his eyes, made Jimmy feel like he could trust him. "A couple of years," he admitted quietly. "I left home when I was 15. It's just been me since then." Dr. Carter didn't press for more details, sensing that Jimmy wasn't ready to share everything. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his mind working through what he had just learned. "That's tough," he said after a moment. "No kid should have to go through that." Jimmy shrugged, trying to downplay it. "It is what it is," he said, though the weariness in his voice betrayed his attempt at nonchalance. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the clatter of trays and the hum of conversation filling the gaps between them. Dr. Carter broke the silence first. "You know," he began, choosing his words carefully, "there are places that can help you. Shelters, programs. You don't have to do this alone." Jimmy shook his head, his defenses coming up. "I've been to shelters before," he said, his voice flat. "They're not safe. I'd rather take my chances on the streets." Dr. Carter frowned, understanding the reality of Jimmy's situation. He had worked in the emergency room long enough to know how dangerous shelters could be, especially for someone as young as Jimmy. But he also knew that life on the streets was no safer. What about your family? Is there anyone you can go back to? The question hung in the air, and Jimmy's expression hardened. No, he replied shortly, his tone signaling the end of that line of questioning. Dr. Carter didn't push further. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table to Jimmy. If you ever need anything, even if it's just someone to talk to, call me, he said. I mean it. No pressure, no strings attached. Jimmy stared at the card, his mind racing. He had met plenty of people who made empty promises, offering help that never came. But something about Dr. Carter was different. The man seemed sincere, like he genuinely cared. Slowly, Jimmy picked up the card, slipping it into his pocket. Thanks, he said, not quite meeting Dr. Carter's eyes. I appreciate it. Dr. Carter smiled, but there was a sadness behind it, as if he could see all the pain and struggles Jimmy had been through. You don't have to thank me, he said softly. Just take care of yourself, okay? Jimmy nodded, finishing the last of his meal. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to accept the help Dr. Carter was offering, to have someone in his corner, someone who actually cared whether he lived or died. But the fear of getting hurt again, of trusting someone only to be let down, was too strong to ignore. As they stood to leave, Dr. Carter glanced at his watch. I need to get upstairs, he said, his voice tinged with regret. But you're welcome to stay here as long as you like. The cafeteria stays open 24/7. Thanks, but I should go, Jimmy replied, already feeling the familiar urge to retreat to the anonymity of the streets. Dr. Carter reached out and squeezed Jimmy's shoulder gently. Take care of yourself, Jimmy. And remember, you're not alone. Jimmy gave a small nod, then turned and walked out of the cafeteria. As he stepped back into the cold morning air, the warmth of the hospital seemed to fade away, leaving him with nothing but the business card in his pocket and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Jimmy stepped out of the hospital and into the crisp morning air, the chill biting at his skin despite the layers he wore. The contrast between the warm, bustling cafeteria and the stark reality of the streets was jarring. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure of where to go next. The city was waking up around him, people rushing to their jobs, taxis honking, and the sounds of life beginning to fill the air. But for Jimmy, everything felt distant, like he was watching it all from behind a glass wall. He reached into his pocket and felt the smooth edge of Dr. Carter's business card. The thought of having someone to call, someone who might actually help him, was comforting, but it also scared him. Trust didn't come easy after all he'd been through. With a sigh, he pushed the card deeper into his pocket and started walking, his footsteps echoing softly against the concrete. As Jimmy made his way through the city, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder a few times, but there was nothing unusual, just the usual mix of early commuters and street vendors setting up their stalls. Still, the unease lingered, a knot tightening in his stomach. He quickened his pace, ducking into an alley that led to a quieter part of town, where the streets were narrower and the buildings older. The alley was empty except for a few garbage bins and the distant hum of a delivery truck unloading its cargo. Jimmy's breath came out in puffs of mist as he walked, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He knew this part of town well. It was where he usually slept, hidden away from the main streets, where fewer people bothered him. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with a group of older kids, teenagers like him, but tougher, meaner. They were hanging out by a chain-link fence, smoking and joking around, their laughter harsh and mocking. Jimmy knew better than to make eye contact, but it was too late. One of them, a tall boy with a shaved head and a sneer, noticed him and stepped forward. "Hey, look who it is," the boy said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Little Jimmy, haven't seen you around lately. Where you been hiding?" Jimmy kept his head down, hoping to avoid a confrontation. "Just around," he muttered, trying to sidestep the group, but they closed in, blocking his path. The tall boy smirked, leaning in closer. "You look like you've been eating good," he remarked, eyeing Jimmy's slightly fuller frame from the meal he'd just had. "Where'd you get the money, huh? Or did someone finally take pity on you?" Jimmy clenched his fists, feeling the tension in the air. He knew how these encounters could go. He'd been on the receiving end of their harassment before. "It's nothing," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just a meal." The boy's eyes narrowed, his expression turning from playful to predatory. "A meal, huh? Well, maybe you should share with the rest of us. You know, fair's fair." The others snickered, closing in on Jimmy, their presence suffocating. Jimmy's heart raced, his mind scrambling for a way out. He could feel the weight of Dr. Carter's card in his pocket, but he knew that pulling it out would only make things worse. "Come on, Jimmy," the tall boy taunted, shoving him lightly. "Don't be selfish. What else you got?" Before Jimmy could react, one of the other boys reached into his pocket, pulling out the business card. "What's this?" the boy asked, holding it up for the others to see. Jimmy's face flushed with panic. "It's nothing," he said quickly, reaching for the card, but the boy snatched it away, passing it to the tall boy. Dr. Carter's name and contact information were printed clearly on the card, and the tall boy's eyes gleamed with malicious interest. "Well, well," he said slowly. "Looks like Jimmy's got himself a friend. A doctor, no less. Maybe we should give this guy a call, see how much he's willing to pay to keep his little buddy safe." The others laughed, but Jimmy's fear turned to anger. He lunged forward, grabbing the card out of the boy's hand. "Leave him out of this," he snapped, shoving the card back into his pocket. The tall boy's expression darkened, and for a moment, Jimmy thought he might actually hit him. But then, almost as quickly as the tension had escalated, the boy seemed to lose interest. He shrugged, taking a step back. "Relax, Jimmy," he said, his tone mocking. "We're just messing with you. But watch yourself. You don't want to make enemies in this town." With that, the group backed off, still laughing as they sauntered down the alley, leaving Jimmy standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited until they were out of sight before he let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling. The encounter had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. He pulled the business card out of his pocket, staring at it for a long moment before carefully putting it back. Jimmy knew he couldn't stay here. The streets were dangerous, and not just because of people like those kids. There were too many risks, too many ways things could go wrong. But he also knew he wasn't ready to trust anyone, not even Dr. Carter, with everything he was dealing with. With a heavy heart, Jimmy started walking again, this time with no destination in mind. He just needed to move, to keep going, even if he didn't know where he was headed. Jimmy walked for hours, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't seem to quiet. The morning had turned into afternoon, and the streets grew busier as people went about their day. But Jimmy barely noticed the passing time or the shifting crowds. His encounter with the group of teens had shaken him more than he cared to admit, and Dr. Carter's business card felt like a burning weight in his pocket. Eventually, his aimless wandering led him to Central Park, a place where he often found some measure of peace. The vast green spaces, the sound of children laughing, and the sight of couples walking hand in hand offered a brief escape from the harsh realities of his life. He found a quiet bench near the edge of the park, away from the more crowded areas, and sat down heavily, his legs aching from all the walking. As he sat there, Jimmy's thoughts kept returning to Dr. Carter. The man had seemed genuine, someone who really cared, not just about the wallet but about Jimmy as well. But Jimmy had been burned before, by promises that were never kept, by people who claimed to help but only made things worse. Trusting someone like Dr. Carter felt like stepping off a cliff, not knowing if there would be anything to catch him at the bottom. Jimmy took the business card out again, staring at the neat, printed letters, Dr. Matthew Carter, MD. Beneath the name was a phone number, a direct line to someone who had offered him a way out, a lifeline. But as he traced the letters with his finger, he wondered if it was really that simple. Could a doctor, a stranger, really understand what he had been through, what he was still going through? Lost in thought, Jimmy didn't notice the elderly woman approaching him until she was right in front of him. She was small and slightly stooped, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that made her seem even more approachable. She wore a simple coat, and in her hand was a brown paper bag. "Hello, young man," she said softly, her voice warm and soothing. "You look like you could use something to eat." Jimmy blinked, surprised by her presence and by the unexpected offer. He hadn't even realized how hungry he still was until she mentioned it. The woman held out the paper bag, and after a moment's hesitation, Jimmy took it. Inside was a sandwich, neatly wrapped in wax paper, and an apple. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough from the day's cold air and lack of use. The woman sat down beside him, her movements slow but steady. "It's no trouble at all," she replied, watching him with a gentle concern. "I always carry a little extra with me. You never know who might need it." Jimmy unwrapped the sandwich and took a small bite, the simple, homey taste filling his mouth. It was the second good meal he'd had today, and the contrast with his usual fare was stark. He glanced at the woman, wondering what had prompted her to approach him. As if sensing his unspoken question, she smiled again. "I see you here often," she said, her eyes searching his face. "You're always alone. I've lived in this city a long time, and I can tell when someone is struggling. It's hard out there, isn't it?" Jimmy nodded slowly, swallowing another bite of the sandwich. He didn't know how to respond to her kindness, so he simply said, "Yeah, it is." The woman didn't press for more details, didn't ask the intrusive questions he was used to. Instead, she sat quietly beside him, as if just being there was enough. After a few moments of silence, she spoke again. "You know, my husband used to sit right here on this bench with me every Sunday. We'd feed the birds and talk about all sorts of things. He passed away last year, but I still come here. It reminds me of him." Jimmy listened, the woman's words wrapping around him like a blanket. There was a sadness in her voice, but also a quiet strength, the kind that comes from living through hard times and finding a way to keep going. He didn't know why she was telling him this, but he felt a strange comfort in her story, a connection he hadn't expected. "I'm sorry," Jimmy said softly, unsure what else to say. The woman smiled gently. "Thank you, but don't be. He lived a good life, and we had many happy years together. I think about him every day, but I'm not sad. Not anymore. I'm grateful for the time we had." Jimmy nodded, finishing the sandwich and reaching for the apple. As he bit into it, the crisp sweetness reminded him of times long past, memories of his own childhood, before everything had gone wrong. The woman's presence, her kindness, made him think about the life he could have had, the life he still wanted deep down. After a while, the woman stood up, her movements slow but sure. "I should be going," she said, looking down at Jimmy with that same gentle smile. "But I want you to know, young man, that there are good people out there. People who care. Don't lose hope, okay?" Jimmy looked up at her, something tightening in his chest. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She patted his shoulder lightly before turning to walk away, her small figure slowly blending into the crowd. As Jimmy watched her leave, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, almost too faint to grasp, but it was there. He looked down at Dr. Carter's card again, and this time, the idea of calling didn't seem so impossible. With the apple core still in his hand, Jimmy stood up, slipping the card back into his pocket. The weight that had felt so heavy earlier now felt a little lighter. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city as Jimmy left Central Park. The streets were beginning to fill with the evening rush, people hurrying home after a long day. Jimmy moved through the crowds, his thoughts still lingering on the old woman's words and the business card in his pocket. The sense of hope she had sparked in him was fragile, but it was there, nudging him to consider what he had been too afraid to admit. Maybe he didn't have to face everything alone. As he walked, Jimmy found himself heading back toward the hospital, the place where his day had started and where Dr. Carter had extended that unexpected hand of kindness. Part of him still hesitated, unsure if he was ready to take such a step, but something stronger pushed him forward. He had survived on the streets by following his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him to go back. When he reached the hospital, the lobby was much quieter than it had been that morning. The rush of patients and staff had slowed, leaving an almost peaceful atmosphere in its place. Jimmy stood just outside the automatic doors, staring at the entrance as if it were some kind of threshold. Crossing it might change everything. With a deep breath, he pushed through the doors and stepped inside. The warmth of the hospital enveloped him once more, a stark contrast to the cool evening air outside. He made his way to the reception desk, unsure of what he would say or even if Dr. Carter would still be around. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up as he approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jimmy swallowed, suddenly feeling nervous. I'm looking for Dr. Carter," he said, hoping he didn't sound as uncertain as he felt. "Is he still here?" The receptionist smiled, seeming to understand his hesitation. "Dr. Carter? Let me check." She typed quickly on her computer, scanning the screen for a moment. "He's just finishing up with a patient. I can let him know you're here if you'd like to wait." Jimmy nodded, relieved. "Yeah, I'll wait." She gestured toward a small seating area nearby. "You can have a seat over there. It shouldn't be long." Jimmy thanked her and moved to the chairs, his heart pounding in his chest. As he sat down, the reality of what he was doing began to sink in. He was here, waiting to talk to someone who had shown him nothing but kindness. A man who had no reason to care, yet somehow did. Minutes ticked by, and with each one, Jimmy's nerves grew. He considered leaving more than once, but each time, he reminded himself of what was at stake. He had nothing to lose by staying, but leaving could mean giving up on something important, something he might not get another chance at. Finally, Dr. Carter appeared at the end of the hallway, his white coat standing out against the dull hospital walls. He spotted Jimmy almost immediately and made his way over, a look of surprise and maybe relief on his face. "Jimmy," Dr. Carter greeted him warmly, extending his hand. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Is everything okay?" Jimmy shook his hand, feeling a strange mix of emotions. "Yeah, I guess so," he stammered, not sure where to begin. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about not having to do this alone." Dr. Carter nodded, his expression encouraging. "I'm glad you came back. It's a big step, and it takes courage. Why don't we find somewhere quiet to talk?" Jimmy nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Dr. Carter led him down a hallway to a small, private office. The room was simple but comfortable, with a desk, a couple of chairs, and a few framed photos on the walls. Dr. Carter motioned for Jimmy to sit in one of the chairs while he took the other. Once they were seated, Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but serious. "I know you've been through a lot, Jimmy, and I know it's not easy to trust people, especially after everything you've been through. But I meant what I said this morning. I'm here to help, if you'll let me." Jimmy looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. The words were on the tip of his tongue, but saying them out loud felt like opening a wound he'd kept hidden for so long. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Start wherever you feel comfortable," Dr. Carter replied, his tone patient. "There's no rush, no pressure. Just take your time." Jimmy took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had spent so long building walls around his heart, keeping everyone at a distance. But something about Dr. Carter's calm presence made him want to let those walls down, just a little. "I left home when I was 15, Jimmy began, his voice shaky but steadying as he spoke. "Things weren't good there. My mom had problems and my stepdad, he wasn't a good guy. I couldn't take it anymore, so I left. I thought I could handle it, but it's been harder than I thought." Dr. Carter listened intently, his expression one of quiet empathy. He didn't interrupt, letting Jimmy find his own pace. "I've been on the streets ever since," Jimmy continued, the words coming a bit easier now. "I've tried shelters, but they never felt safe. It's been a lot of moving around, trying to stay out of trouble, trying to survive. Some days are better than others, but it's lonely." As the words left his mouth, Jimmy realized how true they were. He had been alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to share his burdens with someone else. Dr. Carter nodded, absorbing everything Jimmy had said. "That's a lot for anyone to go through, especially at your age," he said gently. "It's no wonder you're feeling the way you are. But you don't have to do this on your own anymore. There are options, safe places, programs that can help you get back on your feet. And I'm here to help you navigate that, if you're ready." Jimmy hesitated, the fear of disappointment creeping in. What if it doesn't work out?" he asked, voicing the doubt that had been gnawing at him. What if I end up right back where I started? Dr. Carter met his gaze, his expression serious but kind. There are no guarantees, Jimmy, he admitted. Life is full of uncertainties. But what I can promise you is that you won't be alone in this. We'll take it one step at a time, and if something doesn't work, we'll figure out another way. You don't have to be afraid to try. Jimmy felt a lump rise in his throat, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't carrying that weight alone. Maybe, just maybe, he could let someone else help him, even if it meant risking the pain of disappointment. Okay, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I'm ready to try. Dr. Carter smiled, a look of genuine warmth and relief crossing his face. That's all I can ask, Jimmy. We'll get through this together, one step at a time. As they sat in the quiet office, the city outside moving on without them, Jimmy felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about the promise of help. It was the realization that someone cared enough to walk this path with him. And for the first time in a long time, that path didn't seem so daunting. In the days that followed, Jimmy's life took on a strange new rhythm. With Dr. Carter's guidance, he began to navigate a world that had once felt unreachable, a world where help was not just a fleeting promise, but a tangible reality. It was a slow, often uneasy process, filled with small steps and even smaller victories. But each day, Jimmy found himself inching closer to something he had almost forgotten existed: stability. Dr. Carter connected Jimmy with a local youth shelter that had a good reputation, a place known for being safe and supportive. The first time Jimmy walked through its doors, he felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the instinctive urge to bolt. The shelter was clean and warm, filled with other kids around his age, some with stories not too different from his own. It was a far cry from the chaotic, overcrowded places he had avoided before, and for once, he didn't feel like just another number. The staff at the shelter welcomed him with genuine smiles, asking his name and showing him around. There was a bed for him, clean sheets, and even a small locker where he could keep his belongings, few as they were. The sense of having a place to call his own, even temporarily, was overwhelming. For so long, Jimmy had lived day to day, never knowing where he would sleep next or if he'd be safe. Now, there was a bed waiting for him every night. But it wasn't just the physical comforts that made a difference. The shelter offered more than just a place to sleep. It had programs to help kids like Jimmy get back on their feet, counseling, education, job training. Jimmy found himself attending sessions with a counselor named Lisa, a woman with a calm demeanor and a knack for making him feel at ease. At first, he had been reluctant to talk, the walls he had built around himself still standing strong. But Lisa had a way of drawing him out, her questions gentle but persistent. One afternoon, as they sat in a small room lined with bookshelves, Lisa asked him about his dreams. "What do you want to do, Jimmy? What do you see yourself doing in the future?" The question caught him off guard. For so long, his focus had been on survival, on getting through each day. The future had always been a distant concept, something other people had the luxury to think about. He shrugged, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I haven't really thought about it." Lisa smiled, not surprised by his response. "That's okay," she said. "You've been through a lot. But now that you're in a safer place, it might be time to start thinking about what you want, not just what you need." Jimmy looked down at his hands, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "I used to think about it," he said quietly. "Before everything happened. I wanted to be an artist. I used to draw all the time. It was the one thing that made sense, you know? But that was a long time ago." "Why did you stop?" Lisa asked, her tone gentle. Jimmy sighed, the memories flooding back. "After I left home, there wasn't much time for that. I lost all my stuff, and drawing just didn't seem important anymore. I had to focus on staying alive." Lisa nodded, understanding. "It makes sense. But you know, art can be a powerful way to express what you're feeling, to process everything you've been through. Have you thought about picking it up again?" Jimmy hadn't. Not really. The idea of drawing again felt strange, almost foreign. But as Lisa spoke, he felt a flicker of something. An old, familiar itch in his fingers, the urge to create, to pour out everything he had bottled up inside. He glanced up at Lisa, who was watching him with patient curiosity. "Maybe," he said, his voice cautious. "I guess I could try." Lisa smiled, a look of approval in her eyes. "That's all I'm asking, Jimmy. Just try. You might find it helps in ways you didn't expect." That evening, after dinner, Jimmy found himself alone in the small art room the shelter had set up for the kids. It was a simple space, with a few tables, some paper, and a selection of pencils and paints. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that Jimmy had come to appreciate. He sat down at one of the tables, hesitating for a moment before picking up a pencil. For the first time in years, Jimmy let his hand move freely across the paper, sketching out shapes and lines, letting his thoughts spill onto the page. At first, the movements were stiff, awkward, but as he continued, something inside him began to loosen. The pencil became an extension of his hand, each stroke a release of tension he hadn't realized he was holding. Hours passed, and by the time he looked up, the room was dark, the only light coming from a small lamp on the table. Jimmy stared at the drawing in front of him. A cityscape, rough and unfinished, but full of life. It was far from perfect, but it was his, a piece of himself he had reclaimed. As he looked at the drawing, a strange sense of peace settled over him. It wasn't just the act of drawing that felt good. It was the realization that he still had something inside him worth holding on to, something that hadn't been destroyed by the years on the streets. The next morning, Dr. Carter came by the shelter to check in on Jimmy. He found him in the common area, the drawing from the night before folded neatly in his lap. When Dr. Carter asked how he was doing, Jimmy hesitated for a moment, then handed him the drawing. Dr. Carter unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the lines and shapes Jimmy had created. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "This is incredible, Jimmy," he said, his voice full of admiration. "You've got real talent." Jimmy felt a flush of pride at the compliment, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "It's just a sketch," he mumbled, trying to downplay it, but Dr. Carter wasn't having it. "It's more than that," Dr. Carter insisted, handing the drawing back. "It's a part of you, and it's something worth nurturing. Have you thought about pursuing this more seriously?" Jimmy looked at the drawing again, a question forming in his mind, a question he hadn't dared to ask himself until now. Do you think I could really do something with this? Like, make it into a career?" Dr. Carter leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to, Jimmy. You've already survived more than most people could handle. If art is what you love, then yes, I believe you can make it into something real. But it's up to you." Jimmy nodded, the idea slowly taking root in his mind. It wasn't just about survival anymore. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he wasn't just scraping by, but actually living, creating, and building something for himself. As he sat there, with Dr. Carter's encouraging words echoing in his mind, Jimmy realized that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to find his way back to the person he used to be, the person he still wanted to become. The weeks that followed marked a turning point in Jimmy's life. With Dr. Carter's support and the stability provided by the shelter, he began to rebuild the pieces of himself that had been lost to the streets. Each day, he found new reasons to hope, small victories that gradually added up to something greater. Jimmy started spending more time in the shelter's art room, often losing himself in his sketches for hours. It became his sanctuary, a place where he could let his guard down and express everything he had kept bottled up inside for so long. His drawings evolved from simple sketches to more detailed, complex pieces, cityscapes, portraits, and abstract designs that reflected the whirlwind of emotions he was still learning to process. The staff at the shelter took notice of his talent, and so did the other kids. One day, as he worked on a particularly detailed drawing of the New York skyline at sunset, a girl about his age named Sarah came over to watch. "That's amazing," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "I've seen you in here a lot, but I didn't realize you were this good." Jimmy looked up, surprised by the compliment. He wasn't used to people taking an interest in his work. "Thanks," he replied, feeling a bit shy. "I've been drawing for a while. It's just something I do." Sarah smiled, leaning in to get a closer look at the drawing. "You should do something with this, you know? Like, go to art school or something. You could totally make a career out of it." Jimmy hesitated, the old doubts creeping back in. "I don't know," he said, his voice uncertain. "Art school costs money, and I don't even have a high school diploma. Besides, I'm not sure I'm good enough." Sarah shook her head, her expression serious. "Don't sell yourself short, Jimmy. You've got real talent, and there are scholarships, grants, all kinds of ways to make it happen. You just need someone to help you figure it out." Jimmy absorbed her words, feeling a flicker of hope. He had been thinking more and more about his future, about what he might be able to achieve if he took the plunge and pursued his passion. But the path ahead still felt uncertain, and he wasn't sure where to start. That evening, after another counseling session with Lisa, Jimmy decided to talk to Dr. Carter about his doubts and hopes. Dr. Carter had become a constant presence in his life, checking in regularly and offering guidance whenever Jimmy needed it. Jimmy had come to trust him more than anyone else, and he knew that if anyone could help him make sense of his future, it was Dr. Carter. They met in the small office where they had talked before, the walls lined with books and the air filled with the comforting scent of old paper. Jimmy sat down, his drawing from that afternoon folded neatly in his lap. Dr. Carter noticed the serious expression on Jimmy's face and leaned forward, giving him his full attention. "What's on your mind, Jimmy?" Dr. Carter asked, his tone gentle and encouraging. Jimmy hesitated, then handed over the drawing. Dr. Carter unfolded it, taking in the intricate details. The way the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a golden glow over the buildings, the shadows stretching out like long fingers. He studied it for a moment before looking back at Jimmy. "This is incredible," Dr. Carter said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You've captured the city perfectly. What made you draw this?" Jimmy shrugged, feeling a bit vulnerable. "I don't know. I guess I was just thinking about how much things have changed, how I see the city differently now. It used to feel like this huge, scary place, but now, I don't know, it feels more like home." Dr. Carter nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind Jimmy's words. "You've been through a lot, and you've come a long way. It's natural to see things differently now that you're in a better place." Jimmy looked down at his hands, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about what you said before, about art and my future. I guess I'm starting to believe that maybe I could do something with it. But it's just so overwhelming, you know? There's so much I don't know, about school, about how to make it all work. I'm scared I'll mess it up." Dr. Carter leaned back in his chair, considering Jimmy's words. "It's okay to be scared, Jimmy. Change is always scary, especially when it's something as important as your future. But fear doesn't have to stop you. You've already shown so much courage just by getting to this point. The rest is about taking it one step at a time." Jimmy nodded, feeling a bit more at ease. "But where do I even start? I don't have a diploma, and I've been out of school for so long. Who's going to take a chance on me?" Dr. Carter smiled, his expression full of reassurance. "You start right where you are, with what you have. First, we can work on getting your GED. It's not as hard as it seems, and there are plenty of resources to help you prepare. Once you have that, you can look into community colleges or art programs that offer scholarships. There are people out there who will see your talent and your potential, just like I do." Jimmy felt a warmth spread through him at Dr. Carter's words. For so long, he had seen himself as someone who didn't have a future, someone who was stuck in a life he hadn't chosen. But now, he was beginning to see the possibilities that scared him, but also excited him. I guess I'll try," Jimmy said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It sounds crazy, but maybe it's not impossible." Dr. Carter's smile widened, and he reached out to pat Jimmy's shoulder. "It's not crazy at all, Jimmy. It's the start of something new, and you're not alone in this. I'll be here to help you every step of the way." They spent the rest of the evening talking about the practical steps Jimmy would need to take. Enrolling in a GED prep course, researching art schools, and even starting to build a portfolio. With each new plan, Jimmy felt a little more confident, a little more certain that he was on the right path. By the time he left Dr. Carter's office, the city outside was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, the night air cool and refreshing. Jimmy walked slowly, his mind buzzing with everything they had discussed. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward, not just surviving, but truly living. As he made his way back to the shelter, Jimmy reached into his pocket and pulled out the drawing Dr. Carter had praised. He looked at it under the dim light of a street lamp, a smile spreading across his face. This was his work, his talent, and it was worth something. More importantly, he was worth something. That night, as Jimmy lay in his bed at the shelter, he allowed himself to dream, really dream, about the future. He imagined himself in a studio, surrounded by canvases and sketches, his hands covered in charcoal and paint. He imagined his work hanging in galleries, people admiring the scenes he had created. And for the first time, those dreams didn't feel out of reach. They felt possible. With that thought, Jimmy closed his eyes, the weight of the day lifting from his shoulders. Tomorrow was a new day, and for once, he was looking forward to it. The days turned into weeks, and Jimmy's life continued to change in ways he never thought possible. With Dr. Carter's unwavering support, he enrolled in a GED prep course at a local community center. It was a small, modest place, but to Jimmy, it felt like the first step towards something bigger. The first few classes were tough. He had been out of school for so long that even the basics felt foreign. But Jimmy was determined, and for the first time in years, he had a goal worth fighting for. The other students in the class were a mixed group. Some were adults who had never finished high school. Others were kids like him, trying to make up for lost time. They all had their reasons for being there, and Jimmy found comfort in knowing he wasn't alone in this struggle. The teacher, Ms. Ramirez, was patient and encouraging, her enthusiasm infectious. She took a special interest in Jimmy, often staying after class to help him catch up on what he had missed. "Jimmy, you're doing great," Ms. Ramirez said one afternoon as they worked through a particularly challenging math problem. "I can see how hard you're trying, and it's paying off. Don't get discouraged." Jimmy smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thanks, Ms. Ramirez. I just want to make sure I get it right. I don't want to mess this up." Ms. Ramirez nodded, her expression serious but kind. "I understand, but remember, it's okay to make mistakes. That's how we learn. What matters is that you keep going, no matter what." Jimmy took her words to heart, and over time, he began to see progress. Concepts that had once seemed impossible to grasp started to make sense, and he found himself looking forward to each class. It wasn't just about getting the diploma. It was about proving to himself that he could do it, that he was capable of more than just surviving. Meanwhile, his passion for art continued to grow. Dr. Carter had introduced him to a friend who owned a small art supply store, and with their help, Jimmy began to build a portfolio. The more he drew, the more he realized that art wasn't just a hobby. It was a way for him to communicate everything he had experienced, everything he had felt during his years on the streets. His sketches were raw, emotional, filled with the grit and pain of his past, but also with the hope he was starting to find. One day, as he was sketching in the shelter's art room, Sarah came by to see what he was working on. She had become one of his closest friends, someone who understood the journey he was on because she was on a similar path herself. "Wow, Jimmy," Sarah said, leaning over to get a better look at his latest piece. A portrait of a young boy sitting on a curb, his eyes filled with a mix of defiance and vulnerability. "This is powerful. You can really feel what he's going through." Jimmy nodded, still focused on the details of the boy's face. "That's the point," he said quietly. "I want people to see what it's like, to understand what it feels like to be out there, alone." Sarah looked at him, admiration in her eyes. "You're really going to do this, aren't you? You're going to make it as an artist." Jimmy paused, letting her words sink in. For so long, he had been afraid to even think about the future, let alone dream about it. But now, with each drawing, each class, he felt that fear slowly being replaced by something else, confidence. "I think I am," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "For the first time, I really think I can." The following week, Dr. Carter surprised Jimmy with news that would change everything. They met in the same small office where they had talked so many times before. This time, however, there was a sense of excitement in the air, a feeling that something important was about to happen. "Jimmy, I've been talking to a friend of mine," Dr. Carter began. his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "He runs an art school, one of the best in the city. I showed him some of your work, and he was really impressed. He thinks you have real potential." Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. He had never imagined his work being seen by someone in the art world, let alone being recognized for it. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and disbelief. Dr. Carter smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out an envelope. He handed it to Jimmy, who opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter on official stationery, and as Jimmy read the words, his eyes widened in shock. "They're offering you a scholarship, Jimmy," Dr. Carter explained, his voice filled with pride. "Full tuition, plus supplies. They want you to start in the fall." Jimmy stared at the letter, unable to believe what he was reading. This was it, his dream. Something he had never thought possible was within reach. But with that realization came a rush of emotions: fear, excitement, and a deep, overwhelming gratitude. "Dr. Carter, I don't know what to say," Jimmy whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I never imagined." "You don't have to say anything," Dr. Carter replied, his voice gentle. "You've earned this, Jimmy. You've worked so hard, and this is just the beginning. I know it's a big step, and it's okay to be scared, but I believe in you. We all do." Jimmy felt tears sting his eyes, but he blinked them back, not wanting to lose control. "Thank you," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything. I don't think I'd be here without you." Dr. Carter reached out and squeezed Jimmy's shoulder, his touch reassuring. "You did this, Jimmy. You made the choice to change your life. I just helped you see what was already there." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Jimmy focused on finishing his GED, determined to enter art school with a clean slate. The thought of starting over, of having a fresh beginning, filled him with both anticipation and anxiety. But every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself of how far he had come, of the countless nights he had spent on the streets, of the battles he had fought just to survive. If he could get through that, he could get through anything. When the day finally came for him to take the GED exam, Jimmy walked into the testing center with his head held high. The other students around him were just as nervous, but Jimmy felt a strange sense of calm. This was his moment, the culmination of all his hard work, and he was ready. The exam was challenging, but Jimmy approached it with the same determination that had gotten him this far. He focused on each question, remembering the lessons Ms. Ramirez had taught him, applying everything he had learned. When he finished, he walked out of the center feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever the outcome, he knew he had given it his all. A few days later, the results came in. Jimmy was sitting in the shelter's common area when Ms. Ramirez walked in, holding an envelope with his name on it. His heart pounded as she handed it to him, her expression full of encouragement. "You did it, Jimmy," she said softly. "Open it." Jimmy's hands shook as he tore open the envelope, pulling out the official letter inside. He scanned the words, his breath catching in his throat as he reached the final line. "Congratulations, you have passed the GED exam." A wave of relief and joy crashed over him, and for a moment, he just sat there, staring at the letter in disbelief. He had done it. He had actually done it. Ms. Ramirez smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I knew you could do it," she said, her voice full of warmth. "This is just the beginning, Jimmy. You're on your way." Jimmy nodded, tears welling up in his eyes as he clutched the letter to his chest. For so long, he had been afraid to hope, afraid to believe that a better life was possible. But now, holding that piece of paper in his hands, he knew that anything was possible. The day Jimmy had been working toward finally arrived, a day that, for so long, he had only been able to dream about. The summer was drawing to a close, and the city was alive with energy as the new school year approached. But this year, the anticipation felt different for Jimmy. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was a student at one of the most prestigious art schools in New York City, a place he never imagined he'd belong. The morning of his first day, Jimmy stood in front of the small mirror in his room at the shelter, adjusting his jacket nervously. His reflection showed a young man who was no longer the same boy who had wandered the streets just months before. His face was fuller, his eyes brighter, and there was a confidence in his posture that hadn't been there before. But beneath that confidence, a swirl of emotions bubbled: excitement, fear, and a deep sense of gratitude. As he packed his bag with sketchbooks and pencils, Jimmy's thoughts drifted to Dr. Carter, who had been with him every step of the way. They had arranged to meet outside the school, and the thought of seeing him there, of sharing this moment with the person who had believed in him when no one else did, filled Jimmy with a warmth that steadied his nerves. When Jimmy arrived at the school, he was greeted by the sight of towering buildings, their grand facades hinting at the history and prestige they held. The campus was bustling with activity, students chatting excitedly as they made their way to classes, their arms full of art supplies. Jimmy felt a rush of adrenaline as he took it all in. This was his world now. Standing near the entrance was Dr. Carter, a proud smile on his face as he watched Jimmy approach. He was dressed in his usual professional attire, but there was a casual ease in his posture, a reflection of the bond that had grown between them. "Jimmy," Dr. Carter called out, his voice warm and welcoming. "You made it." Jimmy grinned, his heart swelling with emotion. "Yeah, I did," he replied, walking up to Dr. Carter and shaking his hand. "I still can't believe it." Dr. Carter's smile widened, and he placed a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. "Believe it, Jimmy. You earned this. This is your time." Jimmy nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said quietly. "I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't helped me." Dr. Carter's eyes softened, filled with pride and affection. "I may have opened the door, but you're the one who walked through it. This is all you, Jimmy, and I'm so proud of you." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through together hanging in the air. It was a moment of reflection, of understanding that this was not just the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. "I'm ready," Jimmy said finally, his voice steady with determination. Dr. Carter nodded, his hand still resting on Jimmy's shoulder. "I know you are," he replied. "And remember, no matter what happens, you've already won. You've already proven that you can rise above anything." With those words, Jimmy felt a surge of confidence, a belief in himself that had been hard-won. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that there would be moments of doubt and struggle. But he also knew that he wasn't alone, that there were people who believed in him, who would support him every step of the way. As they walked together toward the entrance of the school, Jimmy felt a sense of purpose, a clarity that had been missing from his life for so long. The future, once so uncertain, now stretched out before him like a blank canvas, waiting to be filled with the colors of his choosing. The first day of classes was a whirlwind of activity. Jimmy met his fellow students, people from all walks of life, each with their own unique stories and talents. He found himself in a community of artists, people who understood the language of creativity, who saw the world in ways that mirrored his own experiences. It was exhilarating, and for the first time, Jimmy felt like he truly belonged. His instructors were seasoned professionals, each with their own style and approach to teaching. They pushed him to explore new techniques, to take risks with his art, and to dig deeper into his own experiences for inspiration. Jimmy thrived in this environment, pouring himself into his work with a passion he hadn't known he was capable of. The fear that had once held him back was now fuel for his creativity, a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he could go. Months passed, and Jimmy's portfolio grew, filled with pieces that told the story of his journey, from the dark days on the streets to the bright possibilities of his new life. His work was raw and honest, reflecting the struggles and triumphs that had shaped him. And as his art evolved, so did he, growing more confident, more certain of his place in the world. One afternoon, near the end of his first semester, Jimmy received an email from the school's director. It was an invitation to participate in the upcoming student exhibition, a prestigious event that showcased the best work from the school students. Jimmy's heart raced as he read the message, barely able to believe that he had been chosen. When the day of the exhibition arrived, the gallery was filled with people, students, faculty, art collectors, and members of the public. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the buzz of conversation and the anticipation of discovering new talent. Jimmy's work was displayed prominently, his pieces drawing the attention of everyone who passed by. As he stood in front of his artwork, Watching people study his pieces, Jimmy felt a sense of pride that was almost overwhelming. This was his story, his voice, and it was being heard. He had turned his pain, his struggles, into something beautiful, something that resonated with others. Dr. Carter arrived at the exhibition later in the evening, his eyes lighting up as he saw Jimmy's work displayed so prominently. He made his way through the crowd, finally reaching Jimmy's side. "This is incredible, Jimmy," Dr. Carter said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've come so far." Jimmy smiled, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, repeating the words he had spoken months before. But this time, they held even more meaning. Dr. Carter shook his head, his expression serious but kind. "You did this, Jimmy. You took control of your life, and you made it into something extraordinary. I'm just grateful I could be a part of your journey." As they stood together, surrounded by Jimmy's artwork, the noise of the gallery faded into the background. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a recognition of how far Jimmy had come. From a lost boy on the streets to a promising young artist with a future full of potential. For Jimmy, this was just the beginning. There were still challenges ahead, still obstacles to overcome, but he knew now that he had the strength to face them. He had found his purpose, his passion, and with it, a new life. A life where he could be proud of who he was, and where he could finally leave the darkness of his past behind. As the night drew to a close, Jimmy took one last look at his artwork, then turned to Dr. Carter, a smile on his face and hope in his heart. The journey had been long and hard, but it had led him here, to this moment. And for the first time, he was excited to see where the road would take him next. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.